My optical sensors are outdated, their focal lenses pitted by the corrosive cleaning agent Silas uses, yet I see the world with a clarity the highborns lack. To them, Ethelgard Zenith is a cathedral of commerce, a glittering ring of gold and carbon fiber orbiting the dying star of Velonis. To me, it is a vast waste generator. My internal storage is 80% full of logs regarding spilled champagne, discarded synth silk wrappers, and the biological detritus of 1,000 alien species. And Silas Thorne. I have logs on him for 3,652 days. Silas moved through the crowd like a ghost in gray coveralls. He was 32 years old today, though he did not know I had tracked the date. He was pushing a heavy-duty grav mop, his eyes fixed on the floor. He had learned long ago that looking at the clients was a glitch bait for trouble. "Easy there, Rust," Silas murmured as I bumped into his heel. "Don't get scrapped because you're ogling the royalty." I chirped a low-frequency acknowledgement. My logic processors noted the irony. The beings in this room could buy entire moons. Yet Silas was worried about me, a machine worth less than their appetizers. In the center of the bay, suspended by 42 high-tensile tractor beams, was the Acheron-X. It was not a ship of metal and bolts. It was a nightmare carved from obsidian-colored flesh. Its hull rippled, a slow, peristaltic motion that suggested it was breathing. Deep crimson veins pulsed beneath the dark skin, glowing like embers in a cooling forge. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. It was the last of the Ouroboros-class bioships, weapons from a war that had ended 900 years ago. "Look at that thing, Silas," I broadcasted to his earpiece. "Its energy signature is off the charts. It's not just powered, it's angry." Silas didn't look up. "It's just another piece of hardware for the bigwigs to fight over, Rust. Let's finish the North Quadrant before the auctioneer starts the bidding. I don't want to be in the splash zone when the credit war starts." On the raised podium, High Auctioneer Valerius stood behind a shield of reinforced glass. He was a man of 60 years, his skin pulled tight by too many rejuvenative surgeries. "Ladies, gentlemen, and entities of the Convergence," Valerius's voice boomed, amplified by 1,000 speakers. "We have reached 10,000. 10,000 attempts to bond with the Acheron-X. 10,000 failures." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the hall. I scanned the dignitaries. Prince Zalor of the Nebula Reach was next. He stepped forward, his 4 arms adorned with rings that cost more than a planetary budget. He was flanked by 6 neural surgeons. "The prince believes his willpower is sufficient," I commented to Silas. "The prince is a scraphead," Silas whispered back, mopping up a puddle of spilled blue wine. The prince climbed the stairs to the neural bridge. He placed his hands on the organic interface, a pair of pulsing, gel-filled nodes. For a second, the bay went silent. The ship's crimson veins flared into a brilliant, blinding scarlet. Then came the scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was a psychic shockwave. My sensors spiked into the red. Prince Zalor was thrown backward, his eyes rolling into his head as white foam bubbled from his mouth. His neural surgeons rushed forward, but they were too late. His brain had been short-circuited by the ship's rejection. "Target KIA?" I asked, my combat log automatically triggering. "No, just brain fried," Silas said, finally looking up. His face was pale. "That's the 10th one this hour. They're going to kill themselves trying to tame that thing." Commander Kalen Var, the head of Guild Security, stepped onto the floor. He was a mountain of a man, his right arm a heavy-duty cybernetic limb. He looked at the twitching prince with pure contempt. "Clear the floor," Var barked. "The ship is agitated. No more bids today. We're moving it to the sub-level for a hard reset." "A hard reset?" Silas muttered as the crowd began to bug out in a panic. "You can't reset a living soul. That's like trying to reformat a person." As the security teams pushed the wealthy guests toward the exits, Silas and I were forgotten. We were part of the architecture. Silas moved toward the shadow of the great ship, intent on finishing his work so he could retreat to his tiny studio apartment in the service sector. "Silas," I buzzed, my sensors picking up a chemical anomaly. "The ship is leaking." He stopped. Near the aft tentacle of the Acheron-X, a viscous, dark fluid was dripping onto the polished white floor. It smelled of ozone and ancient copper. Great, Silas sighed, reaching into his cart for a biohazard cloth. If Var sees that, he'll blame us for not reporting a leak. Just a quick wipe, Rust. Then we're out of here. He knelt down. He didn't use the cloth. He was distracted by the way the fluid seemed to pulse in rhythm with his own heart. Without thinking, driven by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, Silas reached out with his bare hand. Silas, negative. Biohazard protocols, I screamed through the comms, but it was too late. His fingers touched the dark, warm liquid. The Acheron-X didn't scream this time. It whispered. And for the first time in 900 years, the ship stopped breathing. The world didn't explode. It didn't even flicker. Instead, a profound silence descended upon the auction bay, a quiet so deep it felt as if the vacuum of space had finally breached the hull. I watched through my high-frequency cameras as the fluid on Silas's fingers didn't just sit there. It was absorbed. It moved into his pores like ink into blotting paper. Silas froze, his hands still hovering over the floor, his eyes wide and vacant. Silas? I queried. My diagnostic scan showed his heart rate climbing to 180 beats per minute. Silas, move away from the vessel. I am detecting a massive neural spike. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Above us, the Acheron-X began to change. The obsidian skin, usually matte and light-absorbing, turned translucent. I could see the internal organs, huge, throbbing bellows of lung tissue, a core that looked like a captured sun, and miles of neural fiber that looked like glowing gold thread. What is it saying, Rust? Silas's voice was a ragged whisper, not coming through the comms, but spoken into the air. It is not speaking, Silas. It is scanning, I replied, my processors whirring at maximum capacity. It is looking at your DNA. It is looking at everything. Suddenly, the tractor beams holding the ship failed, not because of a power outage, but because the ship had simply told them to let go. The 10,000-ton warship drifted downward, hovering inches above the floor. A seam opened in the underbelly, a warm red light spilling out like blood from a fresh wound. Silas Thorne, a voice roared. I spun my sensor pod. Commander Var was standing 20 meters away, his heavy-duty pulse rifle leveled at Silas's head. His security team was fanning out, their boots thudding against the deck. Step away from the asset, Janitor, Var yelled. Don't move a muscle or I'll burn a hole through your chest. I can't move, Commander, Silas gasped. His feet were being lifted off the ground. Organic tendrils, thin as spider silk, but glowing with the strength of a star's core, were reaching out from the ship's opening. They wrapped around Silas's wrists, his ankles, and his neck. They weren't crushing him. They were embracing him. He's trespassing. Open fire, Var commanded. The security team unleashed a volley of blue plasma bolts. I prepared to witness the end of my friend. I prepared to log the death of the only being who had ever treated me as more than a bucket of bolts. But the bolts never hit. A shimmering field of biogenic energy erupted from the Acheron-X, catching the plasma in midair and dissolving it into harmless sparks. The ship let out a low-frequency hum that vibrated through my chassis, a sound of pure, unadulterated protective fury. Rust! Get in! Silas choked out, his body now being pulled upward into the ship's maw. Negative. I am station property, I began. But Silas reached out a hand, and the ship responded. A tendril lashed out, snagging my utility arm and yanking me off the floor. We were pulled into the warmth. The hull sealed behind us with the sound of a heartbeat. Inside, the Acheron-X was not a machine. It was a cathedral of flesh. The walls were soft, pulsing with a gentle amber light. There were no screens, no buttons, no cold metal. The air tasted of rain and electricity. Silas was lowered into a central seat that seemed to grow out of the floor, a throne of woven muscle and bone. As his back touched the seat, the neural tendrils connected. One plugged into the base of his skull, another into his spine. Silas arched his back, his mouth opening in a silent cry. Neural handshake, 100%, a voice echoed through the ship. It wasn't a computer voice. It was thousands of voices, a choir of the dead and the living. Welcome home, Architect. Architect, Silas gasped, his eyes beginning to glow with a faint golden light. I'm just a janitor. I clean the floors. I'm nobody. You are Silas of the House of Valor, the ship whispered back. the walls rippling in a wave of blue light. "You carry the dormant code. For 900 years I have waited in the dark. For 900 years I have rejected the conquerors and the kings. I waited for the one who cleans the mess. I waited for the one who sees the invisible." I hovered near the throne, my sensors recording a transformation that defied every law of cybernetics I knew. Silas wasn't just piloting the ship, he was becoming it. His pulse was the ship's engine. His vision was the ship's sensors. "Rust," Silas said, and his voice sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once. "I can see them, all of them, the whole station. I can feel the guild's fear. It's loud." "We need to bug out, Silas," I advised, my logic circuit screaming. "VAR is bringing in the heavy hitters. I am detecting 4 capital-class frigates moving into intercept positions outside the ring." "They want to cage us," the ship growled through Silas's lips. "They want to turn us back into a weapon." "No," Silas said, his human hand gripping the organic armrest. "No more cages. Not for me. Not for you." Outside, the Sovereign Acquisitions Guild had surrounded the auction bay with armored plating, trying to trap the wild ship. Commander VAR was shouting orders, his voice filtered through the ship's hull. "Thorne, if you surrender now, we might let you live. You're stealing 10 billion credits of guild property." Silas looked at me, and for a second, the golden light in his eyes softened. He was still the man who shared his synth oil with me. He was still the man who mopped the floors so others could walk in light. 10 billion credits, Silas whispered. "Is that all a life is worth to them?" He closed his eyes. "Acheron, show them how a ghost flies." The ship didn't use thrusters. It didn't use ion engines. It simply folded space. To my sensors, the world became a smear of impossible colors. The auction bay, the gold-leafed walls, the terrified Commander VAR, they all vanished in a blink of a shutter. We were in the void, the deep black. Silas slumped in his seat, the neural tendrils dimming as the jump completed. He looked down at his hands, the hands of a janitor, stained with grease and floor wax. "What have I done, Rust?" "You have committed the largest theft in galactic history," I replied, my focal lenses adjusting to the distant stars visible through the hull's transparency. "And you have also successfully transitioned from a nobody to the most hunted man in the universe. Statistically speaking, our life expectancy has dropped by 99%. Silas let out a dry, shaking laugh. "At least I don't have to clean that floor anymore." I moved closer to him, my metallic body reflecting the amber light of the ship's heart. "No, Silas. Now we have a much larger mess to clean up." Silence is a relative term for a machine. To Silas, the jump into the deep black was a momentary erasure of existence, a blank slate where time and space ceased to have meaning. To me, it was a data storm of impossible physics. My internal chronometer skipped 300 milliseconds, a digital hiccup that felt like a lifetime. When my focal lenses finally recalibrated, the interior of the Acheron-X was no longer a glowing cathedral. It was a suffocating, dim-lit cavern of bruised muscle. Silas was still slumped in the throne, but his condition was deteriorating. I hovered closer, my medical scan beam sweeping over his body. His temperature was 40 degrees Celsius, and his pupils were non-responsive. The neural tendrils at his neck were pulsing with a frantic, rhythmic light, pumping information directly into his gray matter at a rate no human brain was designed to handle. "Silas, can you hear me?" I broadcasted, my internal speakers buzzing with a static-filled urgency. "Your cortical load is at 95% capacity. You need to disconnect or you are going to flatline." He didn't move. A single tear, tinted with the same copper-colored fluid he had touched on the auction floor, tracked a path down his cheek. He wasn't breathing. He was absorbing oxygen directly through his skin from the ship's humid atmosphere. "I am detecting a total system lock," I muttered to myself, my processors whirring. "He is stuck in a feedback loop." The ship groaned, a sound that bypassed my external microphones and vibrated directly into my chassis. It was a mournful, heavy vibration. The Acheron-X was trying to talk, but Silas was a fragile vessel for its ancient voice. I surged forward, my utility arm extending a small, vibrating probe. I had to sever the connection, even if it meant risking the ship's wrath. But as I reached for the neural plug at the base of Silas's skull, the floor beneath me rippled. A wall of muscle surged upward, forming a cage of bone-like ribs around the throne, blocking my path. "Bug out, machine!" a voice echoed in the air. It was not Silas. It was the choir of the dead, thousands of whispers overlapping until they formed a jagged, resonant command. "The janitor is ours," the choir whispered. "He is the first who did not scream for the blade." "Get bent, you overgrown tumor," I chirped, my sensors flaring. "If he dies, you have no pilot. You are just a drifting carcass in the void." The ship hesitated. The rib cage lowered just a few centimeters. In that moment of hesitation, Silas's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the weary brown eyes of a man who had spent his life staring at dirt. They were brilliant, glowing spheres of amber gold. "I see them, Rust," Silas gasped, his voice sounding like a harmony of 3 different tones. "I see the ones who came before." I moved into his line of sight, my red optical light blinking. "Talk to me, Silas." "Stay grounded. You are at 500,000 kilometers from the nearest station. You are in deep space. You are Silas Thorne. You are a janitor." "Janitor," Silas repeated, the word sounding strange in his mouth. "Yes, the ones who fix, the ones who clean. The kings who came before?" "Rust, they didn't want to fix. They wanted to break. They wanted to sharpen the ship until it was a tooth, a claw, a spear." He reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched the pulsing neural fiber at his throat. The ship flinched under his touch, a ripple of blue light washing through the chamber. "They tried to command it," Silas continued, his gaze drifting to the vaulted ceiling of flesh. "They brought their armies, their ambition, their greed. 10,000 years of blood and conquest. The ship remembers every single one of them. It remembers the smell of their burning cities. It remembers the silence of the worlds they ended. The crimson veins in the walls flared, a violent, angry red that made my sensors hiss with interference. The ship was sharing its trauma, a 900-year-old haunting that Silas was now forced to carry. "It's okay," Silas murmured, his hand stroking the armrest of the throne, with a tenderness that made my logic circuits stumble. "It's over now. No more breaking. We're just going to keep things running." "That's what we do, right, Rust? We keep the systems from failing." The anger in the walls subsided, fading into a gentle, bruised purple. The ship let out a long, slow breath, and for the first time since the jump, Silas's heart rate began to stabilize. He slumped back into the seat, his eyes losing their golden sheen, returning to the dull, tired brown I had known for a decade. The rib cage disappeared into the floor. The neural tendrils retracted with a wet, squelching sound, leaving Silas gasping for air as his lungs remembered their job. "You still with me, Silas?" I asked, hovering inches from his face. "I am here, Rust," he wheezed, wiping the copper-colored tear from his cheek. "But I think I left a piece of myself back there. Or maybe it left a piece of itself in me." "You are lucky your brain didn't turn into a bucket of slop," I commented, my medical scanners showing a decrease in his neural load. "That was a high-level handshake. Most of those guild pilots would have been gearheads in seconds. Why did you make it?" Silas looked at his hands. They were shaking. "Because I didn't ask it for anything, Rust. The prince, the military officers, even Commander Var, they all looked at this ship and saw a weapon. They saw power. I just saw a living thing that was leaking and needed a hand. It didn't feel a threat from me. It felt a colleague." "A colleague," I repeated, processing the data. "A 10 billion credit warship thinks a janitor is its co-worker. That is a glitch in the hierarchy if I ever saw one." Silas stood up, his legs wobbling like a newborn calf. "We need to find the core, Rust. The ship is injured. Not just the leak, but something deep inside. It's been dormant for too long. Parts of it are necrotic. It's starving." He began to walk toward the dark corridor at the rear of the bridge. The walls seemed to move with him, the bioluminescence brightening to illuminate his path. I followed, my thrusters humming at a low frequency. "We are currently 2 light-years from the nearest habitable sector," I reminded him. "If this ship fails, we are just a very expensive coffin. We have no food, no water, and my battery cell is at 60%. "The ship will provide," Silas said, his voice gaining a strange, quiet authority. "It has been waiting for an architect to tell it how to grow." It is not a machine, Rust. It's an ecosystem. As we moved deeper into the marrow of the ship, the air grew warmer and heavier. We passed through chambers that looked like massive, translucent bladders, filled with glowing nutrients. We crossed bridges of bone that spanned vast, dark voids where the ship's internal gravity felt thin and fragile. I kept my sensors focused on the walls, looking for signs of the necrotic tissue Silas had mentioned. I found it in the third sublevel. A massive section of the hull was black and shriveled, the crimson veins gone cold and gray. It looked like a gangrenous wound. "It hurts here," Silas whispered, reaching out to touch the dead flesh. Suddenly, a holographic projection flickered into existence in the center of the room. It was grainy and unstable, a ghost of old data. It showed a woman with skin the color of burnished bronze and eyes that shifted between gold and crimson. She was wearing robes of woven light, her expression one of profound exhaustion. "To whoever finds this," the projection said, her voice a melodic trill that made my audio filters buzz. "I am Ilara, the last prime architect of Valor. If you are hearing this, our insurance has failed. The Ouroboros ships were designed to be the lungs of our civilization, the vessels that would carry us into the next age. We did not build them for war, we built them for life." Silas stepped closer to the ghost. "But they used you," he said, as if she could hear him. "They turned the lungs into claws." "We have hidden the core protocols," Ilara continued, her image flickering. "We have locked the ships behind a gate of empathy. Only one who values the maintenance of life over the glory of destruction can wake the Acheron. If you are a conqueror, you will find only a grave. If you are an architect, heal us." The projection vanished, leaving us in the dark. Silas stood silent for a long time, his hand resting on the gray, dead section of the wall. "They were like us, Rust," Silas said finally. "They weren't soldiers. They were builders, and they got caught in the middle of someone else's fire." "That was 900 years ago, Silas," I said, trying to bring him back to the present. "The Valorians are gone. The Guild is here now, and they are definitely not builders." Silas's jaw tightened. "They are coming, aren't they? They didn't let us go that easy." I ran a scan of the local subspace. My long-range sensors picked up a faint, rhythmic pulse. It was the signature of a quantum tracker. One of the tractor beams from the auction house must have tagged the hull with a subdermal beacon before we jumped. "We are being ghosted, Silas. 3 Guild interceptors are closing in. They will be on top of us in less than 2 hours." Silas looked at the necrotic wall, then at his own stained hands. "Then let's get to work, Rust. We have a ship to fix before the trash collectors arrive." The transit to the ship's primary engine chamber felt less like a walk and more like a descent into a digestive tract. Silas moved with a certainty that was not his own, his feet finding purchase on the slick, organic surfaces of the Acheron-X. He didn't use a map. He didn't ask for directions. The ship was feeding him its layout, one heartbeat at a time. I struggled to keep pace, my sensors constantly recalibrating as the interior architecture shifted. A door would open not with a sliding mechanism, but by dilating like an eye. A ladder was not made of metal, but of calcified ribs protruding from a muscular wall. "Silas, slow down," I chirped, my thrusters straining. "I am detecting a rise in the local radiation levels. We are approaching the core." The core was a massive, translucent sphere of amber fluid, 10 meters in diameter, suspended in a forest of glowing neural fibers. Inside the fluid, a crystalline structure pulsed with a terrifying intensity. This was the heart of the Acheron, the biogenic reactor that powered the ship's folding engines and weapons. But it was suffocating. A network of thick, black cables had been grafted onto the core. They weren't organic. They were cold, jagged, and made of a heavy industrial alloy. I recognized the manufacturer's stamp on one of the connectors, Sovereign Acquisitions Guild. "They shackled it," Silas whispered, his voice thick with anger. "Even when it was dormant, they were trying to drain it. They were using it as a battery." I scanned the graphs. "Those are neural taps, Silas. They are designed to bypass the ship's consciousness and draw power directly from the biogenic reaction. It is a crude, brutal way to harvest energy. No wonder the ship is necrotic. These taps are causing systemic organ failure." Silas stepped toward the core, his boots squelching on the damp floor. "We have to get them off, now." "Take a beat, Silas," I warned, my scanners showing a high-voltage charge running through the taps. "If you just pull those out, you will trigger a feedback surge that will cook you from the inside out. We need to bypass the security lock first." "How?" Silas asked, his eyes fixed on the black cables. I extended a manipulator arm, my hacking protocols already searching for a wireless interface. "The Guild is arrogant, Silas. They used a standard encryption key, probably thinking no one would ever be inside the ship to challenge it. I can crack it, but it will take time. Time we do not have. The Guild interceptors are at 50,000 kilometers, I updated, my internal clock ticking towards zero. They have launched their first salvo of boarding torpedoes." Silas didn't flinch. He walked right up to the core, the amber light reflecting in his pupils. He reached out and touched the crystalline structure through the translucent membrane. The ship let out a sharp, piercing whistle. Silas's body rigidified. "Talk to me, Silas," I broadcasted, my processors spiking with anxiety. "What are you doing?" "I'm talking to it," Silas replied, his voice sounding distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of an ocean. "I'm telling it that it's not a battery. I'm telling it to push back. That is not how physics works, Silas. You cannot talk a reactor into ignoring its shackles." The core began to vibrate. The amber fluid swirled violently. A low, guttural thrum shook the engine chamber, so powerful that my optical lenses blurred from the resonance. The black Guild cables began to hiss. The industrial alloy started to glow white-hot, the metal buckling under the pressure of a power surge from within. "He is doing it," I realized, my sensors recording a massive spike in biogenic output. "He is bypassing the software locks by using the ship's own immune system." "Silas, get back," I screamed. "The feedback is building." A massive pulse of golden energy erupted from the core. It hit the Guild taps like a sledgehammer. The black cables exploded, shattered into 1,000 pieces of molten slag that rained down onto the floor. Silas was thrown backward, skidding across the slick surface until he slammed into a wall of muscle. The engine chamber went dark for a split second, then roared back to life with a brilliant, healthy violet light. The gray necrotic sections of the walls began to flush with color as the crimson veins resumed their flow. The Acheron-X was no longer starving, it was awake. "Silas," I chirped, racing to his side. "Silas, status check. Report." He was coughing, a thick, violet mist curling from his mouth. He looked up at me, a lopsided grin on his face. Did we bug out the Guild?" "For now," I said, helping him sit up with my utility arm. "But you just signaled our location to every sensor net in 5 systems. That pulse was loud enough to be heard on the other side of the galaxy." "Good," Silas wheezed, standing up with my support. "Let them hear it. Let them know we aren't just a piece of salvage anymore." Suddenly the ship tilted. A violent impact shook the hull. "Boarding torpedoes have made contact," I alerted. "Northeast quadrant, sublevel 2. They are burning through the hull with plasma torches." "We have Guild Marines inside the wire, Silas." Silas didn't look afraid. He looked focused. He looked like a man who had spent 10 years cleaning up after messes and was finally ready to stop a mess from happening. "Rust, can you access the ship's internal security?" he asked, his voice steady. "The ship has no internal security, Silas. It was not designed to fight its own passengers. It was built by architects, remember? It doesn't have turrets. It doesn't have gas dispersers. But it has us," Silas said, "and it has its own body." He closed his eyes and I felt the neural link reestablish itself without the need for tendrils. He was projecting his will through the air. In sublevel 2, the Guild Marines were moving through the corridors, their heavy-duty boots clanking against the organic floor. They were carrying pulse rifles and neural shockers, their HUDs scanning for the Janitor who had stolen their prize. "Don't worry about the asset," the lead Marine barked, his voice caught by my long-range microphones. "Just find the pilot and put a bolt in his head. The Guild wants the ship intact. The man is expendable." "Expendable," Silas repeated, his voice echoing through the ship's speakers in sublevel 2. The Marines stopped, their weapons raised. "Who said that?" The floor beneath the Marines suddenly turned into liquid. They stumbled, their heavy boots sinking into the softening flesh of the ship. What One of the Marines yelled, his legs already trapped up to his knees. "The floor is eating us." "It's not eating you," Silas whispered from the engine room. "It's just taking out the trash." The walls in sub-level 2 began to contract. The organic corridors moved like a giant throat, pushing the Marines back toward the breach they had made in the hull. They fired their pulse rifles, the blue bolts scorching the walls, but the ship healed as fast as they could break it. A massive, muscular wave surged through the corridor, picking up the 4 Marines and hurling them out of the breach and into the cold, silent void of space. "Breach sealed," I noted, my sensors showing the ship's hull knitting back together with incredible speed. "Intruders neutralized. But Silas, the interceptors are launching their main batteries. They are going to slag us from the outside." "Take us into the gas giant," Silas commanded. "The one in the Veloni system. That is 4 light years away, Silas. We cannot make another jump so soon. The core is still stabilizing." "We aren't jumping," Silas said, his hand resting on the core's membrane. "We're folding." He closed his eyes again, and I felt the ship's consciousness expand. It wasn't the frantic, drowning sensation from before. It was a partnership. Silas Thorne, the man who had been invisible for a decade, was now the focal point of a 900-year-old intelligence. The Acheron-X didn't move forward. It moved sideways, not in physical space, but through the hidden layers of reality that the Valorians had mapped centuries ago. The Guild interceptors fired their main cannons, the massive energy beams tearing through the space where we had been a millisecond before. But we were already gone. We emerged in the upper atmosphere of Velonis Prime, a swirling, violent cauldron of purple and gold gases. The storms here were powerful enough to crush a standard frigate into a cube, but the Acheron-X moved through the turbulence with the grace of a predatory fish in a deep ocean. "We are hidden," I reported, my sensors struggling to see through the atmospheric interference. "The Guild's trackers cannot penetrate this level of storm. We have bought ourselves some time." Silas slumped to the floor, the golden glow fading from his eyes for the final time today. He looked exhausted, his gray coveralls soaked with sweat and violet mist. "Why did they do it, Rust?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The Valorians. Why build something so powerful and then make it so gentle?" I considered the question, my logic cores processing the data from the Alara projection. Maybe because they realize that power is not measured by what you can destroy, Silas. Maybe they realize that the ultimate power is the ability to sustain life in a galaxy that is trying to end it. Silas nodded, his eyes closing as he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. I sat by his side, my red optical light pulsing slowly, keeping watch over the man who had become an architect by accident. I looked at the glowing core, the heart of the Acheron. It was pulsing with a steady, peaceful light. I realized then that the ship wasn't just Silas's weapon or his home. It was his mirror. He spent his life cleaning up the messes of the powerful, invisible, and unthanked. And now he was at the center of the galaxy's greatest mess, with the power to change everything. "I hope you are ready for this, Silas," I thought, as I began to run a diagnostic on my own systems. Because the Guild is not going to stop. They will bring more ships. They will bring more fire. And eventually you will have to decide if you are an architect of peace or a janitor of war. I checked my internal clock. It had been 6 hours since we left the auction house. In that time, Silas had saved a ship, fought off a boarding party, and discovered a lost civilization secret. "Not bad for a day's work," I muttered, using a small cleaning cloth to wipe a smudge of grease from my utility arm. But the real work is only just beginning. I settled into a low-power mode, my sensors tuned to the swirling purple clouds outside. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a piece of salvaged hardware. I felt like a witness to something ancient and new. And for a machine, that was more than enough. The Veloni storms raged around us, a symphony of thunder and lightning that seemed to sing a song of defiance. Deep within the marrow of the ship, Silas Thorne dreamed of stars and shadows, while the Acheron-X breathed, its crimson veins pulsing with the slow, steady rhythm of a soul that had finally found its way home. We were safe for now, but the galaxy was vast, and the ghosts of the marrow were restless. The war that had ended 9 centuries ago was not as dead as the history books claimed. It was just waiting for someone with the right hands to pick up the pieces. And Silas Thorne had very good hands. I turned my focal lens toward the sleeping man. His face was calm, the lines of worry and fatigue smoothed away by the amber light. He looked like he finally belonged somewhere, even if that place was a 900-year-old biological warship on the run from the law. It's a start, I thought. It's a start. The storms of Velona's Prime were a chaotic choir of ammonia and lightning, but inside the Acheron-X, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweet, like overripe fruit. Silas Thorne slept for 16 hours, 42 minutes, and 12 seconds. I know this because I sat perched on a calcified rib strut above him, my sensors monitoring the slow, rhythmic expansion of his lungs. His sleep was not peaceful. I could see the rapid eye movement beneath his lids, the way his fingers twitched as if he were still gripping the organic controls of the throne. He was dreaming in Valorian, his subconscious mind sifting through the layers of the neural echo. "Rust," he whispered, his eyes snapping open. The golden light was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow exhaustion. I saw them again, the ones in the cradle. I hovered down, my optical lens whirring as I focused on his face. "You were talking in your sleep, Silas. Something about seeds and shadows." "My database has no translation for the specific dialect you were using. It appears to be a pre-war architectural jargon." Silas sat up, rubbing his face. His gray coveralls were stiff with dried salt and bioluminescent residue. He looked like a man who had been dragged through a swamp, yet there was a clarity in his gaze that hadn't been there when he was scrubbing the executive lounges of Ethelgard Zenith. "It's not jargon, Rust. It's a memory. This ship isn't just a vessel. It's a mother." "A mother," I repeated, my logic processors struggling with the biological metaphor. "My classification for this entity is bioorganic dreadnought, or a Boros class. Mothers usually involve a much smaller scale of production." Silas stood up, his movements fluid despite the bruising on his shoulders. "The ship is hurting, Rust, not because of the Guild's taps. It's hurting because it's carrying something it can't protect. Take me to the ventral sublevels, the deep ones. I am detecting a significant increase in atmospheric pressure and temperature in those sectors, Silas. The oxygen levels are also 20% higher than standard human tolerance. It is not a safe environment for a terrestrial biped." He didn't listen. He was already walking, his hand trailing along the pulsing wall. The Acheron-X responded to his touch, the floor sloping downward to create a ramp, the bioluminescent moss brightening into a soft, inviting green. As we descended into the belly of the ship, the industrial hum of the biogenic reactor faded, replaced by a low, rhythmic thumping that sounded like a dozen hearts beating in sync. The corridors widened into vast vaulted chambers, where the walls were covered in translucent, pulsating sacs. Each sac was roughly the size of a human infant, suspended in a thick, amber-colored fluid. Inside each one, I saw a tiny, curled shape. A miniature version of the Acheron-X, with delicate, translucent fins and a glowing core no larger than a marble. "The nursery," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with a reverence I couldn't quantify. "There are 242 of them," I noted, my sensors counting the heat signatures. "They are bioship embryos." "Silas, this is impossible. The Ouroboros class was supposed to be extinct. The Valorians were sterilized by the convergence at the end of the war." "They hid the seeds," Silas said, walking toward the nearest sac. He placed his hand against the warm, vibrating membrane. The embryo inside reacted, its tiny tail fin twitching toward his palm. "They didn't build weapons, Rust. They built a future. The Guild didn't just want a warship. They wanted the source. They wanted to harvest these seeds to grow their own fleet of mindless, shackled monsters." The horror of the statement hit my processing core with the weight of a planet. If the Guild obtained these embryos, they wouldn't need a pilot with a Valorian genetic key. They could engineer the ships from the ground up to be obedient, soulless tools of destruction. They could turn the galaxy into an assembly line of living terror. "Is this why the ship chose you?" I asked. "Because you're a janitor? Because you're the only one who wouldn't look at these things and see a profit margin?" Silas looked at the embryo, his reflection caught in the amber fluid. I've spent my life cleaning up the trash of the elite, Rust. I've seen what they do to things they think are beneath them. They break them. They discard them. To the guild, these are just assets. To me, they're just kids. The ship let out a low, mournful groan. Suddenly, a section of the wall across the chamber dissolved, revealing a concealed alcove. Inside was a large metallic crate, etched with the Sovereign Acquisitions Guild seal. "What is that doing here?" Silas asked, his eyes narrowing. I flew toward the crate, my scanning beam penetrating the lead-lined casing. "Silas, this is not Valorian tech. This is a seeker drone, a high-yield neural tracking explosive. It's been here since the auction house." The crate hissed, the lid sliding open. A spider-like machine, no larger than a human head, crawled out. Its optical sensor was a cold, piercing blue, and it emitted a high-frequency chirp that made my audio filters skip. "A zero-day sleeper," I muttered, my combat protocols redlining. It was a Trojan horse. When the ship was in the sub-level for the hard reset, the guild must have planted this. It didn't activate until it sensed the ship's primary systems were back online. The seeker drone didn't move toward us. It moved toward the nursery. "It's targeted on the embryos, Silas. If it detonates, it will release a neurotoxin that will liquefy the seeds. It's a failsafe. If the guild can't have the ship, they ensure no one else can have the future." Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a plan or a tactical assessment. He lunged for the drone, his hands reaching for the jagged, metallic legs. "Silas, bug out!" I screamed. "It's rigged with a proximity shock." The drone flared with a blinding blue light. Silas was thrown backward, his gray coveralls scorched, his hands blackened by the electrical discharge. He hit the floor hard, but he was already scrambling back up. "It's not going to touch them," Silas growled, his voice distorted by the neural link. The ship responded to his fury. The floor beneath the drone turned into a sticky, tar-like substance, slowing its movement. But the drone was persistent, its plasma cutters sparking as it tried to carve a path toward the nearest embryo sac. I dived, my utility arm extending to grab the drone's sensor pod. I pulled with all the torque my small servos could muster, but the drone was anchored. "Self-destruct sequence initiated," I broadcasted. 30 seconds to detonation. "Silas, we have to vent this chamber. It's the only way to save the rest of the ship." "If we vent the chamber, the embryos will die in the vacuum," Silas yelled, his eyes glowing with that terrifying golden light again. "No one dies today, Rust. Not on my watch." He ran toward the drone again, but this time he didn't try to grab it. He reached for the neural fibers hanging from the ceiling, the glowing gold threads that connected the nursery to the ship's heart. He wrapped the fibers around his arms, his body jerking as the raw power of the biogenic reactor flowed through him. He was using himself as a conductor. Through the link, he commanded the ship to open a small, localized portal, a microfold in space, directly beneath the drone. It was a maneuver that required the precision of an expert architect and the raw willpower of a madman. The space beneath the seeker drone began to ripple, a black hole no larger than a coin forming in the organic floor. The drone struggled, its metallic legs scraping against the bone struts, but the gravitational pull was too strong. 10 seconds, I alerted, my sensors blinded by the spatial distortion. Silas roared, his muscles bulging, his skin turning a translucent, glowing amber. He pushed his will into the ship, forcing the microfold to expand. The drone was sucked in, its blue sensor eye flickering one last time before it vanished into the fold. A millisecond later, a muffled explosion vibrated through the hull, coming from somewhere thousands of kilometers away in the deep void. The microfold snapped shut. Silas collapsed, the golden fibers falling from his scorched arms. The amber light in the chamber dimmed, returning to its peaceful, mossy green. I hovered over him, my diagnostics showing severe internal hemorrhaging and neural exhaustion. He had survived, but at a cost that made my logic cores ache. "You are a scraphead, Silas," I whispered, my voice synthesizer cracking. "You could have been KIA. You could have been shredded by that fold." He looked up at the embryos, his breathing shallow and ragged. "But they're okay, right?" "They are safe, Silas," I confirmed. The 242 heartbeats are steady. He closed his eyes, a faint smile on his face. Good. Then it was worth the overtime. But my sensors were already picking up a new threat. The microfold had worked, but the energy signature was a beacon. The guild would have seen it. They would be here soon. And this time, they wouldn't be sending drones. The test of Silas Thorne had begun, and the price of his empathy was a target on his back that would never disappear. He wasn't just a janitor anymore. He was the protector of a nursery, and the galaxy had no mercy for the weak. The transition from the nursery to the medical bay was a blur of violet mist and Silas's pained groans. The Acheron-X was attempting to heal him, but its methods were alien and invasive. It was knitting his flesh with biogenic threads, a process that looked like 1,000 needles working in unison beneath his skin. Silas was drifting in and out of consciousness, his mind caught in the neural echo. "Rust," he murmured, his hand grabbing my utility arm with a strength that made my sensors spike. "Vane. He's here. I can feel his hunger." "Commander Vane?" I queried. "Silas, the guild ships are still 20,000 kilometers away. They are navigating the outer storms. Not in space, Rust. In the echo. He's part of it." I paused my repair cycle. My logic cores raced. How could a guild commander be part of a 900-year-old Valorian neural network? It was a paradox. Unless the guild's connection to the Valorians was deeper than a simple salvage operation. "I am running a deep layer scan of the Echo's history logs," I broadcasted. What I found was a zero-day revelation. The Sovereign Acquisitions Guild wasn't just a corporate entity. It was the descendant of the very military-industrial complex that had betrayed the Valorians 9 centuries ago. They hadn't just won the war, they had stolen the blueprints of their enemies' souls. "Vane isn't just a soldier, Silas," I said, my voice clinical. "He is the scion of the House of Malachor, the ones who commissioned the Ouroboros ships as weapons of genocide. He believes he has a birthright to this vessel." "Then he's going to be disappointed," Silas wheezed, sitting up as the biogenic needles retracted. "Because the ship doesn't like him. Not one bit." A massive impact rocked the Acheron-X. It wasn't a torpedo. It was a harpoon. I switched my sensor feed to the external cameras. A guild seeker ship, a predatory silver vessel shaped like a jagged shard, had latched onto our hull. It was using a high-density magnetic tether to anchor itself. "They are attempting a forced breach at the primary airlock," I alerted. "Silas, we have to bug out. If they get a neural jammer inside, they can hardlock the ship's consciousness." "Take us out of the storm," Silas commanded, his voice hardening. "If they want to fight, we'll give them one where they can see us." "Silas, that is a tactical error. We are one ship against a specialized hunter." "We aren't just one ship," Silas said, standing up. "We're an architect." He didn't go to the throne this time. He stood in the center of the bridge, his arms outstretched. He was no longer using the interface nodes. He was the interface. The amber light of the ship flowed into him, turning his veins into glowing gold rivers. The Acheron-X surged out of the Valoni storms, the purple clouds parting like a curtain. The seeker ship was still attached, dragging behind us like a parasite. Inside the airlock, the guild marines were burning through the organic seal with a thermite drill. I could hear the sizzling of flesh and the hiss of escaping atmosphere. "Silas, they are through the first layer." I screamed. Silas didn't blink. He reached out with his mind, and I felt the ship's internal gravity shift. In the airlock corridor, the guild marines were suddenly pinned to the ceiling by a force of 3 Gs. Their weapons clattered to the floor, their heavy-duty armor whining under the pressure. "Sit rep," a voice crackled through the marines' comms. It was Vane. "Why have you stopped moving?" "The gravity! It's FUBAR, Commander!" the marine gasped. "We're stuck." "Burn through it," Vane roared. "The janitor is an amateur. He can't hold the focus for long." Vane was right. I could see the strain on Silas's face. His nose was bleeding, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. Maintaining a localized gravity well while piloting a ship through high-velocity maneuvers was a task that would have crushed a team of 20 neural specialists. He's trying to do too much, I thought. He's trying to be the hero, but he's still just a man in gray coveralls. "Silas, let them in," I advised. "We can trap them in the sublevels." You are going to blow a fuse if you keep this up. No, Silas gritted out, his teeth stained with blood. If they get in, they'll find the nursery. I won't let them near the kids. The seeker ship fired its secondary harpoons, 3 more jagged claws burying themselves in the Acheron-X's hull. They were discharging a high-frequency neural shocker, trying to paralyze the ship's mind. The Acheron-X shrieked. It was a sound of pure agony that resonated in the marrow of my chassis. Silas fell to his knees, his hands clutching his head. I see you, Silas Thorne, Vane's voice echoed through the bridge, hijacked by the neural shocker. I see the little man playing God. You think you're an architect? You're a scrap heap scavenger. You're a stain on the lineage of Valor. I'm the one who didn't let them die, Silas wheezed, his eyes fixed on the core monitor. I'm the one who cleaned up your mess, Vane. Empathy is a disease, Vane sneered. It makes you weak. It makes you predictable. You will sacrifice this ship to save those useless embryos, and in doing so, you will lose everything. Give me the ship, and I'll let the janitor walk away. Silas looked at me, and for a moment I saw the fear. He knew Vane was right. He was one man against an empire of cold logic. If he chose to fight, the ship might be destroyed. If he surrendered, the future would be liquefied. What do I do, Rust? Silas whispered, the golden light in his eyes flickering like a dying candle. I looked at the data stream from the nursery, 242 heartbeats, steady and innocent. Then I looked at Silas Thorne, a man who had been told his entire life that he was worth nothing, yet was willing to die for a dream he didn't even understand. You are an architect, Silas, I said, my voice synthesizer unusually soft. And an architect doesn't just build walls, he builds foundations. Silas's expression changed. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, quiet determination. He stood up, the biogenic fibers in the floor rising to meet his hands. Vane, Silas said, his voice broadcasted back to the seeker ship. You want to know what an architect does? He makes sure the trash is disposed of properly. Silas pushed his consciousness into the ship's hull, right where the harpoons were anchored. He didn't try to pull them out. He did something far more dangerous. He commanded the ship to shed its skin. The outer layer of the Acheron-X's hull, a thick armored epidermis, suddenly detached. It was like a snake molting its skin. The harpoons, the magnetic tethers, and the guild seeker ship were all still attached to the discarded flesh. The seeker ship was thrown backward by the sudden loss of tension, tumbling into the vacuum of space, draped in 10,000 tons of dead bioorganic skin. Silas didn't stop there. He commanded the Acheron-X to execute a snap jump, a short-range fold that bypassed the standard cooldown protocols. We emerged on the far side of the gas giant, the massive planet now a shield between us and the guild. The bridge went silent. The golden light in Silas's eyes faded, and he collapsed into the throne, his breathing a harsh, rattling sound. The Acheron-X was naked now, its inner muscular layers exposed to the cold of space, its crimson veins pulsing with a frantic, wounded rhythm. Silas, the hull integrity is at 40%, I reported, my sensors scanning the damage. We have lost 60,000 square meters of primary armor. We are vulnerable. But we're alive, Silas wheezed, his hand reaching out for mine. And the nursery is safe. I held his hand with my utility arm, the metallic claw feeling strangely warm against his skin. You chose the hard path, Silas. You sacrificed your protection to save the weak. That is not a decision a conqueror would make. No, Silas said, his eyes closing. It's what a janitor does. He takes the hit so the place stays clean. As the Acheron-X drifted in the shadow of Valonus Prime, I realized that the humanistic lesson wasn't about finding a purpose. It was about realizing that Silas's purpose had always been there. He hadn't changed. He had simply found a stage large enough to match the size of his heart. But the cost was rising. The guild would be back, and next time, they would be bringing the heavy hitters, the dreadnoughts that could slag a planet. Silas was an architect without a wall, and the cold void of the galaxy was waiting to see if his empathy would be his salvation or his grave. I stayed by his side, my optical light pulsing in the darkness. I was just a drone, a machine of logic and scrap. But in that moment, I understood why the ship had chosen him. It hadn't looked for a pilot, it had looked for a soul. And Silas Thorne, for all his flaws and his gray coveralls, was the only soul left in a galaxy of gears. The Acheron-X was a raw, red wound in the dark. Without its obsidian epidermis, the ship looked vulnerable, its internal musculature exposed to the harsh radiation of the Velonis system. We drifted for 3 days, 2 hours and 15 minutes in the shadow of a shattered moon, hiding within the silicate dust clouds to mask our heat signature. Silas spent most of that time in a state of semi-lucid communion with the ship, his hands buried deep in the pulsing neural moss of the bridge, feeding the vessel his own strength while it knit itself a temporary fibrous scar tissue. I spent the time monitoring the sub-ether frequencies. The guild was not quiet. They had declared Silas Thorne a galactic terrorist of the highest order. His face, the weary, unremarkable face of a man who had spent a decade scrubbing floors, was now plastered across every news feed from the inner rim to the scattered fringe. They called him a thief. They called him a butcher. They offered a bounty of 500 million credits for his head, and twice that for the ship. 500 million, I muttered, hovering near Silas as he stirred from his trance. That is enough currency to buy a small moon, or at least 50 billion high-grade utility drones. You have become very expensive, Silas. Silas opened his eyes. They were bloodshot, the golden light flickering weakly behind his irises. Only 500 million? I thought the guild valued their assets more than that. I guess I'm still just a low-wage worker to them, even when I'm stealing their gods. His voice was hoarse, but he managed a tired grin. He looked at his hands, which were now permanently stained with a faint, iridescent glow. He stood up, his legs trembling. The Acheron-X groaned in sympathy, a low vibration that made the floor feel like a purring animal. We can't stay here, Silas said, his gaze fixed on the violet storms of the gas giant below. The ship is stable, but it's not whole. It's scared, Rust. It feels like a dog that's been kicked too many times. It wants a place where it doesn't have to keep its hackles up. I ran a calculation. There is a sector 3 light-years to the galactic north. It is officially designated as the Gehenna Shallows. It is a massive graveyard of dead ships, slag stations, and radioactive debris from the first expansion wars. No one goes there because the scrap is too contaminated to be worth the salvage cost. It is a place for the forgotten. Silas nodded. Perfect. That's our neighborhood, isn't it? The place for things no one wants. The jump to the Gehenna Shallows was shorter this time, the Acheron-X sliding through the folds of space with a weary, practiced ease. When we emerged, I had to recalibrate my optical sensors to account for the sheer density of metal. For thousands of kilometers in every direction, the husks of ancient vessels hung in the void like frozen leviathans. There were dreadnoughts from the Sol Union, cruisers from the Alpha Centauri hegemony, and tens of thousands of smaller drones, escape pods, and utility rigs. It was a monument to waste. It was the ultimate junkyard. Silas walked to the transparent section of the hull, staring out at the wreckage. Look at it all, Rust. All this work, all these lives, just left to rot because they weren't useful anymore. I am detecting thousands of low-level energy signatures, I noted. My long-range scanners picking up faint, rhythmic pulses from the wreckage. Silas, this place isn't dead. There are autonomous systems still running. Survival loops. Suddenly, a swarm of small, flickering lights emerged from the hull of a nearby rusted freighter. They were utility drones, hundreds of them. But they weren't like me. They were salvaged, cobbled together from different models, their chassis patched with mismatched plates and glowing with jury-rigged power cells. They moved in a synchronized, defensive formation, circling the Acheron-X like a school of scavenger fish. Unidentified vessel, a voice crackled over an ancient, wideband radio frequency. It was a voice made of 100 different audio samples, a digital mosaic. This is the litter. You are trespassing in the hollow. State your intent or be recycled. Silas looked at me, his eyebrows raised. The litter? I'll handle the comms, I said, broadcasting our identification codes. This is Rust MK4 Utility Unit, serial number 0934. I am accompanied by a biological architect. We are not scavengers. We are seeking sanctuary. Our vessel is damaged and we have dependents. The swarm of drones paused. A larger unit detached itself from the group. It was a heavy-duty construction mech, its hydraulic arms replaced with surgical lasers and multi-tools. It floated toward our airlock, its sensors glowing with a sharp, suspicious blue. An architect? The mosaic voice asked. The architects are ghosts. They left us in the dirt 9 centuries ago. Why should we believe a pristine drone and a man in a rag? I'm a janitor, Silas said, leaning toward the comm pickup. And the ship is an Ouroboros class. We're all just things the guild tried to throw away. If that's not enough of a resume for you, then I don't know what is. There was a long silence, the only sound the static of the nebula. Then the large construction mech let out a hissing sound, the sound of ancient pressurized steam. A janitor, the voice echoed, a hint of something like digital humor in its tone. The one who cleans the mess. Very well, janitor. Bring your wounded god into the hangar of the indomitable. We will see if you are truly of the litter, or just more guild slag. The indomitable was a colossal supercarrier, its hull snapped in half centuries ago, now held together by massive cables and biogenic vines that Silas recognized as Valorian in origin. As we docked, I saw the true scale of the sanctuary. There were thousands of discarded machines and a few dozen biological outcasts, humans and aliens alike, who had been chewed up by the corporate machine and spat out into the void. They lived in the cracks of the dead ships, building a world out of the refuse of empires. Silas stepped out of the airlock, his boots clanging against the rusted deck of the hangar. He was greeted by a woman whose lower half was a multi-legged walker unit and a group of drones that looked even more beat up than I was. I'm Juno, the woman said, her voice raspy from breathing recycled air for too long. I'm the chief scavenger here. You've got a hell of a ship there, Thorne. Too bad it looks like it's been through a trash compactor. It gave its skin to save us, Silas said, looking back at the raw, red hull of the Acheron-X. Juno's eyes softened as she looked at Silas's scorched coveralls and his stained hands. We heard about the auction. The whole Shallows is buzzing. They say a nobody stood up to Vane and walked away with the crown jewels. Most of us thought it was just a glitch in the news cycle. It wasn't a glitch, Silas said, but I didn't do it to be a hero. I just didn't want the guild to liquefy the nursery. The machines and the outcasts went silent at the mention of the nursery. In a world where everything was a relic or a piece of scrap, the idea of something new, something living, was like a spark in a dry forest. You brought the seeds here? Juno whispered, her mechanical legs whirring as she stepped closer. To the graveyard? Where else would they be safe? Silas asked. The guild doesn't look at the trash. They're too busy staring at the shiny things. Juno let out a harsh, barking laugh. You've got a point there, janitor. Welcome to the silent sanctuary. It's not pretty, it's not clean, but we don't leave our own behind. For the next 2 days, the litter worked on the Acheron-X. It was a sight that defied my logic cores. Hundreds of mismatched drones, guided by Silas's intuitive understanding of the ship's neural map, began to repair the hull. They didn't use the expensive, biogenic materials of the Valorians. They used what they had: refined scrap, recycled polymers, and sections of old plating from a dozen different civilizations. The Acheron-X didn't reject the scrap. It accepted it. The ship's biogenic fibers knit into the rusted metal, turning the vessel into a patchwork warrior, a mosaic of history and survival. It was no longer a pristine god of the Valorians. It was a ship of the litter. Silas worked alongside them, his hands moving with a practiced rhythm. He wasn't the master here. He was just another unit in the repair crew. He talked to the drones, he shared his meager rations with the outcasts, and he listened to their stories of being discarded, of being told they were worth nothing. I spent 20 years in the mines of Kalis, an old man named Hax told Silas as they welded a plate onto the ship's ventral fin. When my lungs gave out, they didn't even give me a pension. They gave me a bus ticket to the orbital waste chute. If Juno hadn't caught me, I'd be stardust by now. Silas nodded, his eyes fixed on the weld. They think if you aren't producing, you aren't real. They think utility is the only measure of a soul. And what do you think, janitor? Hax asked. Silas looked at the Acheron-X, its new patchwork hull gleaming in the dim light of the hangar. I think the things they throw away are the only things that can actually fix this galaxy, because we're the only ones who know what it's like to be broken. As I watched Silas, I realized his transformation was nearly complete. He wasn't just finding a purpose. He was realizing that his purpose had always been to see the value in the forgotten, but the lesson was about to be tested in fire. My long-range sensors, which I had anchored to a derelict satellite 300 kilometers out, suddenly screamed a warning. "Silas, hard contact," I broadcasted, my audio filter sharp with panic. "I am detecting a stealth signature. High-frequency guild encryption. They didn't use trackers this time. They followed the energy wake of the repaired hull." The hangar doors of the Indomitable groaned as a massive shadow fell over the sanctuary. It was the Sovereign's Debt, the Guild's flagship dreadnought. It was 6 kilometers of polished, weaponized arrogance, and it was currently targeting the graveyard with enough firepower to turn the Gehenna Shallows into a second sun. "Thorne!" Commander Vane's voice boomed over the wideband, clear and cold. "We know you're in there. You have 3 minutes to surrender the asset and the embryos. If you do not, we will sanitize this sector. Every drone, every outcast, and every piece of scrap will be atomized." Juno looked at Silas, her mechanical legs twitching in fear. "Silas, we can't fight a dreadnought. We're a junkyard." Silas looked at the Acheron-X, then at the hundreds of drones and the broken people who had helped us. The humanistic theme I had been tracking reached its boiling point. He had a choice. He could bug out, using the ship's folding engines to save himself and the nursery, leaving the litter to be sanitized. Or he could stand and fight for the trash. "Russ," Silas said, his voice quiet but echoing with the strength of the Acheron. "Tell them to get ready." "Ready for what, Silas?" I asked. "We are outnumbered 10,000 to 1. Silas stepped onto the ramp of the ship, his golden eyes flaring to life, brighter than I had ever seen them. "Ready to show them that you can't just throw us away," Silas said, "because the trash is about to take itself out." The 3 minutes passed like a slow-motion collapse of a star. Inside the Acheron-X, the atmosphere was no longer sweet. It was sharp with the scent of ozone and determination. Silas was not in the throne. He was standing in the center of the bridge, his bare feet connected to the neural moss, his arms outstretched like a conductor preparing for a symphony of war. "Rust, synchronize with every drone in the litter," Silas commanded. "Use the ship's biogenic core as a localized network hub. We aren't just one ship anymore. We're an army of scrap." "Silas, that is a massive neural load," I chirped, my processors redlining as I began to broadcast the synchronization protocols. "You are trying to act as the central processor for over 5,000 independent units? Your brain will slag." "Just do it, Rust," Silas gritted out, the golden veins on his neck pulsing with terrifying speed. "I spent my life making sure the machines ran right. Now I'm going to make them run together." Outside, the Sovereign's Debt opened its primary weapon ports. The massive dreadnought looked like a predator hovering over a pile of bones. "Time is up, Janitor," Vane's voice crackled. "Initiating sanitization." The dreadnought unleashed a broadside of plasma lance fire. The beams were designed to melt through hardened military armor, but as they struck the Gehenna Shallows, something impossible happened. The litter moved. 5,000 discarded, rusted, and jury-rigged drones surged forward. They didn't move in random patterns. They moved with the precision of a single organism. Under Silas's direction, the drones gathered the surrounding scrap, sheets of hull plating, broken struts, and frozen debris, and formed a colossal improvised shield in front of the Indomitable. The plasma lances hit the scrap shield, the molten metal glowing white-hot, but the sanctuary remained untouched. What is this?" Vane's voice leaked through the comms, his legendary composure finally showing a crack. "How is he controlling them? There is no central AI signal." "It's not an AI, Vane," Silas roared, his voice broadcasted through the Acheron-X's massive external speakers, vibrating the very wreckage around us. "It's a janitor, and you forgot to check the bins." The Acheron-X surged forward, its patchwork hull glowing with a fierce violet intensity. It didn't fire conventional weapons. It didn't have any. Instead, it acted as the spearhead for the litter. Silas reached out with his mind, and the thousands of drones began to disassemble the wreckage of the graveyard at an incredible speed. They didn't just move the scrap, they weaponized it. They hurled 1,000-ton cruisers like stones. They spun clouds of razor-sharp shrapnel into high-velocity cyclones. The Sovereign's debt was pelted by a storm of its own history. The dreadnought's shields flared and buckled under the sheer mass of the incoming debris. "Fubar! The situation is Fubar!" A guild pilot screamed over the open channel. "The scrap is attacking us. We can't target individual units. There are too many." I was caught in the flow, my own sensors linked to Silas's consciousness. I could feel the thousands of drones, their simple logic cores singing in harmony with the Acheron-X. They weren't slaves, they were partners. For the first time in their long, discarded lives, they had a purpose that wasn't just utility. They had a voice. "Silas, the dreadnought is preparing its main spinal cannon," I alerted, my scanners detecting a massive energy buildup in the center of the guild flagship. "If that fires, no amount of scrap will stop it. It will punch a hole straight through the indomitable." "Then we don't let it fire," Silas said. He looked exhausted, blood trickling from his ears, but his golden eyes were fixed on the Sovereign's debt. "Rust, I need you to lead a strike team. The smallest drones, the ones the sensors can't even see. We're going to clog the drain." "Wilco, Silas," I replied, my combat subroutines taking over. I led a swarm of 500 micro-drones, units designed for cleaning ventilation ducts and repairing delicate circuitry. We moved through the chaos of the debris field, hidden by the massive scrap cyclones Silas was generating. We approached the Sovereign's debt from the rear, slipping into the massive cooling vents of the ship's primary engine core. "Scrub the pipes, boys," I broadcasted to the litter. We didn't use explosives. We didn't need to. We simply used our cleaning tools. We jammed the cooling fans with our own chassis. We sprayed industrial-strength corrosive agents into the neural processors. We clogged the fuel lines with recycled gunk. Inside the dreadnought, chaos erupted. "The engines are overheating," a guild technician yelled. "We have a systemic clog in the primary cooling loop. The spinal cannon is drawing power, but it can't vent the heat. If we fire, we'll blow the whole deck." "Flush them out," Vane screamed. "Use the internal defenses." But the internal defenses were designed to kill humans, not thousands of tiny suicidal cleaning bots. We were the invisible threat, the grime that the guild had ignored for 1,000 years. Outside, Silas and the Acheron-X moved for the final blow. Silas didn't use the ship to ram the dreadnought. He did something much more symbolic. He commanded the litter to gather the most iconic pieces of scrap, the remains of the very ships the guild's ancestors had destroyed, and weld them onto the Sovereign's debt. The dreadnought was being buried alive in the bones of its victims. Massive struts from the Soul Union dreadnoughts were jammed into the guild ship's weapon bays. Rusted hull plates from the hegemony were welded over the bridge windows. The Sovereign's debt was being transformed into a piece of junk. "This is Silas Thorne," Silas's voice boomed, now calm and terrifyingly steady. "Commander Vane, you told me that empathy is a disease. You told me it makes us weak. But look at your ship. It's covered in the things you thought were worthless. It's being held by the people you thought were expendable. Your power is just a pile of stolen scrap. And today, the scrap is taking its debt back." The dreadnought's engines let out a final, sputtering roar and then went cold. The massive ship hung motionless in the void, a glitzy tomb covered in the rusted history of the Gehenna shallows. "Sanitize this," Silas whispered. He released the neural link, and the golden light vanished from the bridge. Silas collapsed, falling into my utility arms as I returned from the sabotage mission. The Acheron-X shivered, its patchwork hull settling back into a peaceful hum. The litter began to disperse, returning to their places among the wreckage. They didn't celebrate. They simply went back to work, repairing the damage to the sanctuary. They had defended their home, and in doing so, they had found a new kind of existence. Juno and Hax entered the airlock of the Acheron-X, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and fear. They found Silas lying on the floor, his breathing shallow, his hands still twitching with the echoes of 5,000 minds. "Is he KIA?" Hax asked, his voice trembling. "No," I said, my medical scan showing a long but stable recovery. "He's just exhausted. He did a lot of cleaning today." Juno looked at the sovereign's debt, the once proud flagship, now a humiliated heap of metal. He did more than that. He showed us that the graveyard isn't where things go to die. It's where they go to wait. She looked at Silas, her eyes reflecting the amber glow of the ship's core. He's not a janitor anymore, Rust. He's the first true architect we've seen in 900 years. Because he didn't build a ship. He built a people. I looked at my friend Silas Thorne. He was covered in grease, his clothes were rags, and he didn't have a credit to his name. But as he slept, the 242 heartbeats in the nursery pulsed in perfect sync with his own. The transformation was painful, and the cost was high, but the lesson was finally moving from subtext to reality. Worth is not something that is given by a guild or a prince. It is not measured in credits or utility. Worth is what happens when someone refuses to let the world stay messy. Worth is the choice to see the soul in the scrap. And as we drifted in the Gehenna shallows, surrounded by the ghosts of the forgotten and the lights of the litter, I realized that Silas was right. The trash didn't need to be discarded. It just needed a better janitor. Stay with him, Rust, Juno said as she prepared to lead her people back to the Indomitable. The galaxy's going to want a piece of him now. They're going to be terrified of a man who can talk to the trash. Let them be terrified, I said, my red optical light pulsing with a new kind of pride. We have a lot more work to do. I settled into my watch, my sensors tuned to the silent patchwork ship and the man who had become its heart. We were fugitives, we were outcasts, and we were broken. But for the first time in 900 years, the Acheron-X was truly alive. Because Silas Thorne didn't just imprint on a ship. He imprinted on the galaxy. The war was far from over. Vane was still alive, and the guild would bring more fire. But as I looked at the 5,000 drones returning to their posts, I knew that the next time they came, they wouldn't be fighting a janitor. They would be fighting the litter. And the litter never ever leaves a mess behind. The silence that followed the silencing of the sovereign's debt was heavier than the vacuum of space itself. In the Gehenna shallows, the only sound was the settle of shifting scrap, the groan of cold metal cooling, and the rhythmic, bioluminescent hum of the Acheron-X. For 10 minutes and 44 seconds, I simply sat on my hover strut, my processors recording the aftermath of a miracle. Commander Vane's flagship, once the terrifying pinnacle of guild military engineering, was now a grotesque monument to irony. It was unrecognizable, buried beneath layers of rusted hull plating and twisted girders. It looked like a giant that had been swarmed by ants and covered in a shroud of their own graveyard. Silas Thorne lay on the floor of the bridge, his fingers still twitching in the neural moss. He was alive, but the golden light in his eyes was dimming, flickering like a lamp running out of fuel. I moved to his side, my medical scanners sweeping over his vitals. Cortical heat is dissipating, I whispered into his earpiece. Your neural pathways are stabilized, Silas. But your physical form is foobar. You have internal bruising on 30% of your torso, and your nervous system is screaming for a reboot. Silas let out a dry, rattling breath. Did we lose anyone, Rust? I ran a quick check on the litter's network. We had 0 casualties among the outcasts. Of the 5,421 drones that participated in the blockade, we lost 412 units. They gave their chassis to clog the vents and reinforce the shield. They are replaceable, Silas. Silas's hand found my utility arm, his grip weak but insistent. No, Rust, they aren't. They were the ones who stood up. They were the ones who chose to be more than just garbage. Every one of those scrap heads is a hero. Juno and Hax entered the bridge, their footsteps echoing on the organic floor. Juno's mechanical legs were scorched from the heat of the hangar, and Hax's breathing was a labored hiss. They looked at Silas with a gaze I had seen before. Not the look given to a coworker, but the look given to a savior. The guild is sending out distress signals on every frequency, Juno said, leaning against a rib strut, but they're localized. The scrap shield is acting as a Faraday cage. No one outside the Gehenna shallows knows what happened yet. We have a window, Silas. Maybe 2 hours before the heavy hitters from the inner rim jump in to see why their flagship went dark. We're not running, Silas said, pushing himself up into a sitting position with an agonizing effort. Not yet. We have to finish what we started. What's left? Hax asked, gesturing to the viewport where the Sovereign's debt hung in disgrace. You broke them, Janitor. You showed them the trash has teeth. I showed them we can fight, Silas countered, his eyes regaining a spark of focus. But if we leave now, they'll just rebuild. They'll come back with more fire, more hate. We need to change the story. Rust, can you bridge the comms? I need to talk to the crew of the debt. Silas, that is a tactical risk, I warned. They are still armed with small arms and internal security systems. If you open a channel, Vane might try another neural hijack. He's already tried his worst, Rust. He's got nothing left but his pride, and that doesn't hold much charge in a cold engine. I complied, my transmitters piercing through the scrap shroud of the guild ship. The bridge of the Sovereign's debt flickered onto our primary display. It was a scene of clinical chaos. Emergency lights bathed the room in a sickly crimson. Technicians were frantically trying to reboot the cooling loops, while Commander Vane stood in the center, his cybernetic arms sparking, his face a mask of frozen aristocratic fury. Thorne! Vane spat, his voice distorted by the interference. You think you've won? You've only succeeded in signing the death warrant of every soul in this junkyard? The Guild does not forgive. The Guild does not forget. We will turn this entire sector into a black hole before we let you keep that ship. Silas didn't look angry. He looked pitying. Vane, look around you. Your ship is 100 kilometers of state-of-the-art tech, and it was brought down by the very things you threw away. You spent 900 years trying to master the Valorian legacy with money and force, but the Valorians didn't build for power. They built for life. That's why you failed. You're trying to pilot a heart with a hammer. I am a scion of the House of Malachor, Vane roared, slamming his sparking fist against a console. I am the rightful architect of this galaxy. You are a mistake, Thorne, a glitch in the system that I will personally erase. You're not an architect, Vane, Silas said, standing up fully now, his presence filling the bridge of the Acheron-X. You're a parasite. You take what you didn't build and you break what you can't understand. But today, the Janitor is taking your keys. Silas reached out toward the core monitor. The Acheron-X responded to his will, its biogenic energy surging through the communication bridge. It wasn't a weaponized pulse. It was a data dump. Silas began transmitting the history of the Ouroboros ships, the true history. He sent the images of the nursery, the 242 embryos, and the words of Ilara, the prime architect. I'm sending this to every crew member on your ship, Silas said. They deserve to know what they're fighting for. They aren't fighting for a future. They're fighting for a battery. They're fighting for a man who would liquefy children to power his ego. On the screen, I watched the guild technicians stop their work. They looked at the displays, at the images of the innocent, glowing seeds in the ship's belly. These were men and women who had signed corporate contracts for credits and security, but they weren't all monsters. They were just workers, like Silas had been. Commander, a young lieutenant whispered, stepping back from his station. Is this true? Are we here to harvest children? Get back to your post, Lieutenant, Vane barked. It's a fabrication, a neural hallucination. It's not, Silas said, and you know it. Vane, your own ancestors were the ones who designed the shackles. You've been living on a debt of blood for 9 centuries. It's time to pay up. The lieutenant looked at Vane, then at the display, then back at his commander. He slowly reached up and unclipped his guild insignia, letting it fall to the floor. I didn't sign up for this. I'm out. One by one, the bridge crew of the Sovereign's debt began to step away from their consoles. The rebellion of the invisible was spreading. Silas hadn't just used scrap to stop a ship. He was using the truth to stop a war. Vane looked around at his deserting crew, his face turning a deep mottled purple. He reached for his pulse pistol, but the lieutenant was faster, his own weapon leveled at Vane's chest. Don't do it, Commander, the lieutenant said, his voice steady. It's over. The Janitor is right. We're just the trash now. Silas signaled me to cut the transmission. He slumped back into the throne, his breathing shallow. The Acheron-X let out a long, resonant hum of satisfaction. You did it, Silas, Juno said, her mechanical legs whirring softly. You didn't just win the battle, you broke their spirit. I didn't break anything, Juno, Silas said, closing his eyes. I just showed them the cracks that were already there. You can't hold a galaxy together with fear forever. Eventually, the grime builds up until the whole machine just stops. I looked at Silas, my processors running a thematic analysis on the current situation. He had transformed the conflict. He had moved from a desperate survival scramble to a moral revolution. He hadn't used his newfound power to destroy his enemies, but to invite them to see the world as he did, as something that needed care, not conquest. But the cost was still evident. The Acheron-X was still scarred, its patchwork hull a reminder of how much had been sacrificed. Silas was still a man on the edge of collapse, and the guild's reinforcements were still coming. "Rust," Silas whispered, his hand resting on the neural moss. "We need to wake the others. The seeds. They can't grow in a graveyard." "Silas, you are too weak for a full nursery wake," I warned. "That requires a massive amount of biogenic energy. You could flatline for real this time." "Then help me, Rust," Silas said, looking at me with a gaze that was both human and architect. "You've been fixing me for 10 years. Fix me one more time." I hovered over him, my optical light pulsing. I wasn't just a drone anymore. I was a witness. I was a friend. And I was the one who would ensure the janitor's work was finished. "Wilco, Silas," I said, "let's get the future started." The Acheron-X moved to the center of the Gehenna Shallows, positioning itself within the densest cluster of the scrap cloud. Silas stood in the engine chamber, his arms wrapped around the biogenic core. He wasn't using the throne anymore. He was part of the heart. Around us, the litter had gathered in a massive, silent circle. 5,000 drones and 42 outcasts, all linked through my relay signal, creating a massive, localized neural web. We were a collective of the discarded, providing the foundation for the awakening. "Architect," the ship's voice whispered, "no longer a choir of ghosts, but a single, resonant harmony. The seeds are ready, are you?" "Ready," Silas said, his voice echoing through the chamber. He closed his eyes and began the rebirth protocol. It was the ultimate expression of the Valorian legacy, a massive release of empathy-encoded energy designed to jumpstart the growth of the next generation. Silas didn't think about combat grids or shield frequencies. He thought about the smell of rain on a colony world. He thought about the feeling of a clean floor. He thought about the time he had found a broken bird in the station's air vents and spent 3 weeks nursing it back to health. He poured his humanity into the ship. Throughout the Acheron-X, the 242 embryos began to glow. The amber fluid in the sacs turned a brilliant, crystalline white. The tiny shapes inside stretched, their translucent fins expanding, their mini cores pulsing with the first beats of independent life. The ship's hull rippled, the rusted scrap plates beginning to shift and grow. The biogenic fibers of the Acheron-X were weaving into the old metal, not just repairing it, but evolving it. The ship was no longer a patchwork warrior. It was becoming a new kind of entity, a fusion of ancient biology and modern scrap, a vessel born of the litter. The energy pulse was so powerful that it cleared the silicate dust of the nebula for 50 light seconds. It was a beacon that could be seen from the inner rim. It wasn't a signal of war. It was the first breath of a new age. As the nursery began to bloom, the Sovereign's debt drifted further away, its crew having evacuated into the escape pods. Commander Vane was left alone on his dead bridge, a man who had everything and now had only the scrap he had once despised. Silas didn't look at the dreadnought. He was watching the first embryo sac dilate. A tiny, glowing bioship, no larger than a utility drone, floated out into the engine chamber. It circled Silas once, its bioluminescence blinking in a rhythmic pattern of curiosity. "Hello, little one," Silas whispered, reaching out with a scorched hand. The tiny ship nudged his palm, a gentle hum of recognition vibrating through his skin. Silas Thorne sat on the floor of the engine room, surrounded by the tiny lights of the future. He looked back at me, his face peaceful, his work finally done. He stood up, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look like he was carrying the weight of the world. He looked like he was a part of it. I sat on a nearby bone strut, my focal lenses zooming in on the man who had changed the galaxy with a mop and a dream. I began to record the final entry in my Silas Thorne log. "Subject has transitioned from janitor to architect," I dictated to my internal memory. "Not by building empires, but by reclaiming what was lost. The humanistic theme of empathy has been successfully integrated into the galactic network. Utility is no longer the sole measure of existence. Empathy is the new OS. Silas walked to the center of the bridge one last time. He looked out at the Gehenna shallows, at the thousands of drones that were now his family. He looked at the vastness of space, which no longer felt cold and indifferent, but full of potential. I've spent 3,652 days watching the world from the sidelines, Silas said, his voice sounding like the first rays of a sunrise. I spent 10 years thinking I was a ghost, a piece of hardware that didn't matter. I thought my value was measured in how many square meters of floor I could clean in a shift. I thought I was lucky to even have a name. He looked at his hands, which were now glowing with a steady, permanent light, the mark of a true architect. I was wrong, Rust. I wasn't a ghost. I was a witness. Being a janitor didn't make me less. It made me more. It taught me that nothing is ever truly broken, just waiting for someone to care enough to fix it. It taught me that the things the powerful throw away are often the things that hold the world together. I found my purpose not in the stars or the war, but in the grime. I found my soul in the scrap. We all have things we think are worthless, don't we? Pieces of ourselves we want to throw away, or people we've decided don't matter because they don't serve a purpose. I spent a decade being one of those people. But now, looking at these 242 lives we saved, and the thousands of drones who found their voice, I have to ask you, what are the pieces of your own life you've labeled as trash, and what would happen if you decided to fix them instead of throwing them away? Silas smiled, a genuine warm smile that made my optical sensors feel a strange digital warmth. He reached out and tapped my sensor pod. Let's get moving, Rust. We've got a lot of cleaning to do. He didn't take the throne. He simply stood at the window, watching as the Acheron-X and its 242 children began to move out of the graveyard. They didn't move as a fleet of war, but as a migration of life. Silas Thorne, the janitor of Valor, began to sweep the stars one heartbeat at a time. The Acheron-X folded space, and for the first time, the jump felt like home.